they're indicting those two individuals on that case. All right, I'm Andy Mack here on Live Now from Fox, just stretching into a new hour, 2 p.m. Eastern, as we're still awaiting 2 months in, and the delays continue to go on involving the presidential immunity case decision, still awaiting for revolving around the former President Donald Trump. A live picture there in Washington, D.C. at this, as we potentially could have heard it today. It could be tomorrow or next week, but certainly still waiting, like so many people are, about this case as well. I do want to bring into the conversation to discuss potentially what's upcoming. Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor, thank you again for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And maybe a little air was let out of the balloon today when we didn't hear a decision. Maybe how soon are we expecting this decision, and what do we make of the delays in this case?
Andy, it may happen as early as tomorrow. I mean, we saw those barricades. So I think the Supreme Court and their security were preparing for some protests really either way. So the anticipation was building. The Supreme Court does issue its decisions at 10 a.m. Eastern. So it may be tomorrow morning, and if not, probably next week, right before the end of the court's term. But obviously, one of the biggest decisions in American history, certainly as far as constitutional law is concerned. So everyone is eagerly waiting what that decision will be.
Yeah, a backlog of different cases. This the one, the top kind of the docket that so many people are waiting on, but plenty of them as well. Is this necessarily common to maybe have them wait till the last minute, because the term is almost rapidly approaching and there's a lot of decisions, a lot of rulings to get out? Is this common, and maybe why has it taken 2 months since those oral arguments?
It is common for the court's most important or most contentious decisions to be issued at the end of the term. Obviously, it's easy if it's unanimous or near unanimous. I don't expect it to be in the Trump case. We may have multiple dissents and concurrences. And obviously, this appeal was fast-tracked after the D.C. Circuit ruled that Donald Trump was not immune. Now, importantly, that Court of Appeals said that a former president doesn't enjoy immunity. I don't think that's the direction the justices will go in. We're going to really read and hear new law when it comes to presidential immunity. And there's certainly a number of different ways that the justices can go in this case.
Yeah, that is a good point, because I think we spoke when the oral arguments were going on some 2 months ago, and that feels like forever ago. And there were some of them talking about, quote, a rule for the ages as well. What did we learn? Take us back to some of those oral arguments. What did we learn there, and maybe how could they match up with what the ruling might be?
Well, during the oral arguments, I think Chief Justice Roberts said the most important thing when he said, what about immunity for official acts? That's historically been the court's ruling. Now, there's not a lot of precedent here. Obviously, we know the Nixon case. But aside from that, when we're talking about immunity for presidents, what's really been litigated has been in the civil context. Trump has litigated it with the defamation cases. Clinton did with Paula Jones and the sexual harassment. But obviously, we haven't seen presidents that have been prosecuted or have faced criminal investigations. Really only two. And, Clinton's problems were more impeachment and state bar related. So not a whole lot here. But if you look at some of the other justices said, maybe this is something that we will see going forward. Justice Jackson talked about no one being above the law, and Gorsuch was saying, well, isn't this creating bad precedent where one administration will come in and prosecute its political opponent? Then we're going to see this political tit for tat. So I think the justices are going to want to get this right, because this is an extremely important constitutional and separation of powers issue here.
Yeah, some of the justices said, quote, a rule for the ages. Let me talk about the decision that we're upcoming as we're awaiting it as well. Could they find a yes or no, or could they kind of find something in the middle? Could it be less than maybe what people are expecting? Because people are expecting a major decision. Could they maybe temper that decision a little bit?
I think we're likely going to see that middle ground, Andy, and I'll kind of go through what I think are the possible outcomes from most likely to least likely. I think the most likely result is the justices will say there is some sort of what we call qualified immunity. It's not absolute. There is immunity for official acts, but not for personal acts. And generally speaking, campaigning has tended to fall outside of a president's or any elected official for that matter, his or her official act. If you're campaigning, you do something unlawful, you can be prosecuted for it. And then then the next possibility is that they will rule that the lower courts need to decide whether the actions leading up to January 6th, whether they were official acts or not. So they might send it down to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals to talk about the fake elector scheme and Trump's actions outside the Capitol building and that famous speech or infamous speech. Same thing with South Florida. They might send it back to the judge there, Judge Kennedy, to decide whether what Trump was doing in Mar-a-Lago with respect to these documents, were they official acts, were they personal? So we're going to go back to the lower courts and have some sort of fact-finding determination. I think, again, that's the most likely outcome. Next, I think the judges will rule that there was no immunity here. They'll actually do the analysis themselves, not just at the rule, but apply the rule to the facts of the case. In which case, that'd be pretty bad for Donald Trump, because that means that what's been paused or stayed in DC and South Florida, really that could resume, and can resume pretty quickly, especially there in DC. I think the least likely outcome is what Trump's lawyers asked in their appeal and in their briefs, and that would be absolute immunity for current and former presidents. I think really that's a bridge too far. I think if you even look at how the justices frame the question, because there always is a question presented in these cases, they really did focus on the distinction between the official acts and personal ones. So I believe, and a lot of folks that really closely follow the Supreme Court see this going in that direction, that middle ground that you talked about, Andy.
Yeah, that is a good breakdown of it and the potential qualified immunity that they might rule on as well. I do want to talk to you about the potential middle ground of these 9 justices and how maybe it will be perceived in terms of 5-4 or 6-3. How big of a factor will that be, and maybe how much are we paying attention to that number in specifics?
I think it's going to be very important. And we know the Supreme Court, just like American politics in general, has been really politicized. You see the polarization there, really sort of the extremes when it comes to the justices. I can say that if you look at the recent decisions, at least, some of them have not broken along those ideological lines, right? We had the FDA abortion case. It was really a standing issue, but you had a rare unanimous decision. You had an important case today, didn't get a whole lot of discussion, for the tax case, where you had the conservative justices joining some of the liberals in an important 7-2 decision. You had a case involving drug trafficking, which is really one of the most common federal crimes. And it talks about expert testimony regarding these organizations and blind mules. And you had Justice Jackson join some of the conservatives, and you had Justice Gorsuch siding with the liberals. So hopefully the justices get it right, and it's not along the 6-3 conservative liberal split, because we know that whatever the decision is, it will be controversial, and I wouldn't be surprised to see protests, regardless of what outcome or what side the justices end up on.
Yeah, controversial and consequential, because basically every case they decide is consequential. We're also awaiting ones on gun rights as well as abortion there from the Supreme Court. But we're talking about this presidential immunity one as well. I do want to talk to you, and maybe the biggest question on a lot of people's minds is about the delay. It's taken 2 months since the oral arguments to have today. We will wait till at least tomorrow and then potentially next week. Does this make it even less likely to go to trial ahead of the November election?
Absolutely. And there's a reason Jack Smith tried to fast track the appeal in this case, even though he had won. Very rare for a winning or a prevailing party to try to appeal the case. But Smith knew that obviously Trump was going to appeal this issue, and the longer it dragged out, it would put those lower court proceedings on hold. And, I would say that Trump's lawyers in all 3 of the remaining cases, not necessarily in the New York case, but in Fulton County, Georgia, in Washington, D.C., and in Florida, have done a masterful job using different procedural tools, including appeals, to delay those cases. Because, of course, if Trump wins in November, he can't be prosecuted. All of these cases go away. So maybe not so much on the substance, but on the procedure, the defense has done a very good job in those cases. I don't expect to see a trial in any of them until 2025, if at all.
Yeah, we're awaiting this decision, and we will have to potentially wait even longer for those trials if they happen, like you said, at all. All right, I'm Andy Mack. Thank you, Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor. Thanks again for breaking it all down here on Live Now from Fox. We're still awaiting this decision from the Supreme Court.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Andy.
All right. Thank you so much.